By the end of this video, you should be able to describe what a parent function is, and you should be able to describe the terms function notation, domain, and range. So a parent function is the simplest graph of a particular type. So every single type of graph has a basic parent function. So for example, y equals x is the simplest linear graph. So that's the parent function for a linear graph. Y equals x squared is the simplest graph of a quadratic, which is those parabola graphs that we've studied before. And then we also can look at y equals the absolute value of x, which is the simplest graph of the absolute value type. So these are three graph types that you've learned about before, and parent graphs are just the simplest versions of that type. Now, children graphs are variations of this parent graph. So the parent graphs essentially get altered, so they get transformed, they get translated, or they get reflected in order to create a child graph. And I like to think about it as you are similar to your parents, but you are not identical to your parents. So the parents are a basic version of that graph, and then the children graphs are variations that have been slightly changed and have slightly different characteristics, but have the same general graph type. So to start off Algebra 2, there are four basic parent graphs that we're going to take a look at. The first one is a constant graph, and the parent graph of a constant graph is a horizontal line here at y equals 1. Then a linear graph, hopefully you remember, is a line. And so the parent graph of a line goes through 0, 0, and then has a slope of 1. The absolute value graph, if you remember from previously, is a V-shaped graph that starts at 0, 0, and then each side has a slope of 1 or negative 1. And then a quadratic graph is a parabola. So if you remember, that's a U-shaped graph that has a shape like this. So you have the absolute value that is V-shaped, and then the quadratic that is U-shaped. So these are sketches of those parent graphs, and we'll be looking at these in a little more detail in another video. So before we dive into parent graphs a little bit more, I want to make sure that we're familiar with some of the function notation that we learned previously in Algebra 1. So what you need to know about function notation is that it is a fancy way of representing the y value of a function. So typically we're used to seeing equations written something like y equals x plus 2 or something of that nature, and function notation uses f of x in place of that. So it would look something like f of x, which is function notation saying the function f is equal to x plus 2. So it's essentially changing out that y value to now be f of x. F of x is just a fancy way of saying y. Now the reason that we use this is because then if we have multiple y's in an equation, we can distinguish between the different equations by using function notation. So for example, we might have g of x equals 3x minus 7, a different function name, and it represents a different function. So instead of writing y equals, y equals, y equals, we use different function names like f of x and g of x to distinguish between different equations that we might be working with simultaneously. Now, a couple of things that you need to note. First is that the parentheses do not represent multiplication here. This is fancy notation. So you'll need to note that these are not saying f times x. It's saying f of x, f is the name of your function. What this means is that you're going to find the value of the function at x equals blank. So f of x is the general term saying we don't know what x currently is, but if you see something like f of 3, what this is saying is you're going to turn x into 3 and evaluate the function at that value. Now, the last thing you really need to know about this, and you've probably heard me say it a couple times in this video already, is that this is commonly read, so f and g here. When you have function notation, it's commonly read as f of x, so the name of the function and then the variable you have inside of here, or something like g of x, or any letter that you pick in place of these two. The last two vocab terms from Algebra 1 we're going to review in this video are domain and range. So what you need to know about domain is that it is the set of all possible input values of a function. So we can list out all of the possible values that can go in as an input, and typically the domain represents all of the x values. Your range is the set of all possible output values of a function. So we'll list all of the values that can be resulting in an output, which are typically all of the y values. So we'll be reviewing this in our upcoming videos, but those are what you need to know about domain and range. Domain is the set of all input numbers, and range is the set of all output numbers.